Chapter 13. Midwich Centrocline. On the following day they returned to Midwich. First, Dr. Margaret Haxby from Norwich with baby. Miss Haxby was no longer on the staff of the Grange, having resigned 2 months before. Nevertheless, it was to the Grange she went, demanding accommodation. 2 hours later came Miss Diana Dawson from the neighbourhood of Gloucester, also with baby, also demanding accommodation. She presented slightly less of a problem than Miss Haxby, since she was still a member of the staff, though not due to return from leave for some weeks yet. Third came Miss Polly Rushton from London, with baby, in a state of distress and confused emotions, asking help and shelter of her uncle, the Reverend Hubert Leabody. The day after that, 2 more ex-staff from the Grange arrived, with their babies, admitting their resignations from the service, but at the same time making it perfectly clear that it was the Grange's duty to find them a room of some kind in Midwich. In the afternoon, young Mrs. Dorry, who had been staying in Devonport to be near her husband in his latest posting, arrived unexpectedly, with her baby, and opened up her cottage. And on the next day there showed up from Durham, with baby, the remaining member of the Grange staff involved. She, too, was technically on leave, but insisted that a place must be found for her. Finally appeared Miss Latterly, with Miss Lamb's baby, urgently returning from Eastbourne, whither she had taken Miss Lamb for recuperation. This influx was observed with varying emotions. Mr. Leabody welcomed his niece warmly, as though she were putting it within his power to make some amends. Dr. Willers was perplexed and disconcerted, as was Mrs. Willers, who feared it might cause him to postpone the much-needed holiday she had arranged for him. Gordon Zellaby had the air of one regarding an interesting phenomenon with judicial reserve. The person upon whom the development pressed most immediately was, without doubt, Mr. Crim. He was beginning to wear a distraught look. A number of urgent reports went in to Bernard. Janet's and mine was to the effect that the first, and probably the worst, hurdle had been crossed, and the babies had arrived without nationwide obstetrical interest. But if he still wished to avoid publicity, the new situation must be dealt with promptly. Plans for the care and support of the children would have to be established on a sound, official footing. Mr. Crim urged that the irregularities appearing in his personnel records were now on a scale that had taken them beyond his control, and that unless there was swift intervention at a higher level, there was soon going to be an almighty rumpus. Dr. Willers felt it necessary to turn in 3 reports. The first was in medical language, for the record. The second expressed his opinions in more colloquial terms, for the lay. Among the points he made were these. The survival rate of 100%, resulting in 31 males and 30 females of this special type, means that only superficial study has been possible. But of the characteristics observed, the following are common to them all. Most striking are the eyes. These appear to be quite normal in structure. The iris, however, is to the best of my knowledge unique in its colouring, being of a bright, almost fluorescent-looking gold, and is the same shade of gold in all. The hair, noticeably soft and fine, is, as well as I can describe it, of a slightly darkened blonde shade. In section under the microscope, it is almost flat on one side, while the other is an arc, the shape being close to that of a narrow D. Specimens taken from 8 of the babies are precisely similar. I can find no record of such a hair type being observed hitherto. The finger and toenails are a trifle narrower than is usual, but there is no suggestion of claw formation. Indeed, one would judge them to be slightly flatter than the average. The shape of the occiput may be a little unusual, but it is too early to be definite about that. In a former report it was surmised that the origin might be attributable to some process of xenogenesis. The very remarkable similarity of the children, the fact that they are certainly not hybrids of any known species, as well as all the circumstances attending gestation, tend, in my view, to support this opinion. Additional evidence may accrue when the blood groups can be determined, that is to say, when the blood circulating ceases to be that of the mother's group and becomes that of the individual. I have been unable to find any record of a case of human xenogenesis, but I know of no reason why it should not be possible. This explanation has naturally occurred to those involved. The more educated women entirely accept the thesis that they are host mothers rather than true mothers. The less educated find in it an element of humiliation, and so tend to ignore it. In general, the babies all appear to be perfectly healthy, although they do not show the degree of chubbiness one expects at their age. The size of the head in relation to the body is that normally found in a somewhat older child. A curious but slight silvery sheen on the skin has given concern to some of the mothers, but is common to all, and would appear to be normal to the type. After reading the rest of his report, Janet took him up on it severely. "Look here," she said. "What about the return of all the mothers and babies, all this compulsion business? You can't just skip that altogether. A form of hysteria giving rise to collective hallucination, probably quite temporary," said Willers. "But all the mothers, educated or not, agree that the babies can and do exert a form of compulsion. Those who were away didn't want to come back here. They came because they had to. I've talked to all of them, and what they all say is that they suddenly became aware of a feeling of distress, a sense of need, which they somehow knew could only be relieved by coming back here. Their attempts to describe it vary because it seems to have affected them in different ways. One felt stifled, another said it was like hunger or thirst, and another that it was like having a great noise battering at one. Farrelyn says she simply suffered from intolerable jitters, but whichever way it took them, they felt it was associated with the babies, and that the only way to relieve it was to bring them back here. And that even goes for Miss Lamb, too. She felt just the same, but she was ill in bed at the time and couldn't possibly come, so what happened? The compulsion switched on to Miss Latterly, and she was unable to rest until she acted as Miss Lamb's proxy and brought the baby back here. Once she had parked it here with Mrs. Brandt, she felt free of the compulsion and was able to return to Miss Lamb in Eastbourne." "If," said Dr. Willers heavily, "if we take all old wives' or young wives' tales at face value, if we remember that the majority of feminine tasks are deadly dull and leave the mind so empty that the most trifling seed that falls there can grow into a riotous tangle, we shall not be surprised by an outlook on life which has the disproportion and the illogical inconsequence of a nightmare, where values are symbolic rather than literal. Now, what do we have here? A number of women who are the victims of an improbable and as yet unexplained phenomenon, and a number of resultant babies which are not quite like other babies. By a dichotomy familiar to us all, a woman requires her own baby to be perfectly normal and at the same time superior to all other babies. Well, when any of these women concerned is isolated from the rest with her own baby, it is bound to become more strongly borne in upon her that her golden-eyed baby is not, in relation to other babies she sees, quite normal. Her subconscious becomes defensive and keeps it up until a point is reached where the facts must either be admitted or somehow sublimated. The easiest way to sublimate the situation is to transfer the irregularity into an environment where it no longer appears irregular, if there is such a place. In this case there is one, and one only: Midwich. So they pick up their babies and back they come, and everything is comfortably rationalized for the time being. It seems to me that there is certainly some rationalizing going on," Janet said. "What about Mrs. Welt?" On the occasion she was referring to, Mrs. Brandt had gone into Mrs. Welt's shop one morning to find her engaged in jabbing a pin into herself again and again, and weeping as she did it. This had not seemed good to Mrs. Brandt, so she had dragged her off to see Willers. He gave Mrs. Welt some kind of sedative, and when she felt better she had explained that in changing the baby's napkin she had pricked him with a pin. Whereupon, by her account, the baby just looked steadily at her with its golden eyes, and made her start jabbing the pin into herself. "Well, really," objected Willers, "if you can cite me a plainer case of hysterical remorse, hair shirts and all that, I shall be interested to hear it." "And Harriman too?" Janet persisted. For Harriman had one day made his appearance in Willers' surgery in a shocking mess, nose broken, couple of teeth knocked out, both eyes blacked. He had been set on, so he said, by 3 unknown men. But no one else had seen these men. On the other hand, 2 of the village boys claimed that through the window they had seen Harriman furiously bashing himself with his own fists, and the next day someone noticed a bruise on the side of the Harriman baby's face. Dr. Willers shrugged. "If Harriman were to complain of being set upon by a troop of pink elephants, it would not greatly surprise me," he said. "Well, if you aren't going to put it in, I shall write an additional report," said Janet. And she did. She concluded it. This is not, in my opinion, or in anyone else's opinion but Dr. Willers, a matter of hysteria, but of simple fact. The situation should, in my view, be recognized, not explained away. It needs to be examined and understood. There is a tendency among the weaker-willed to become superstitious about it and to credit the babies with magical powers. This sort of nonsense does no one any good, and invites exploitation by what Zellaby calls the beldam underground. There ought to be an unbiased investigation. An investigation, though on more general lines, was also the theme of Dr. Willer's third report, which was in the form of a protest, that wound up, "In the first place, I do not see why MI is concerned in this at all. In the second, that it should be, apparently, an exclusive concern of theirs is outrageous. It is disgracefully wrong. Somebody should be making a thorough study of these children. I am keeping notes, of course, but they are only an ordinary GP's observations. There ought to be a team of experts on the job. I kept quiet before the births, because I thought, and still think, that it was better for everyone, and for the mothers in particular. But now that need is over. One has got used to the idea of military interference with science in a number of fields, a lot of it totally unnecessary. But this is really preposterous. It is nothing less than a scandal that such a phenomenon as this should continue to be hushed up so that it is going practically unobserved. If it is not simply a piece of obstructionism, it is a scandal. It must be possible for something to be done within the provisions of the Official Secrets Act, if necessary. A wonderful opportunity for the study of comparative development is simply being thrown away. Think of all the trouble that has been taken to observe mere quins and quads. And then look at the material for study that we have here, 61 similars, so similar that most of their ostensible mothers cannot tell them apart. They will deny that, but it is true. Think of the work that should be taking place on the comparative effects of environment, conditioning, association, diet, and all the rest of it. What's going on here is a burning of books before they have been written. Something must be done about it before more chances are lost. All these representations resulted in a prompt visit from Bernard, and an afternoon of rather acrimonious discussion. The discussion broke up only partly mollified by his promises to stir the Ministry of Health into swift, practical action. After the others had left, he said, "Now that official interest in Midwich is bound to become more overt, it might be very useful, and indeed might help to avoid awkwardness later on, if we could enlist Zellaby's sympathy. Do you think you could arrange for me to meet him?" I rang up Zellaby, who agreed at once, so after dinner I took Bernard up to Kyle Manor, and left him there to talk. He returned to our cottage about a couple of hours later, looking thoughtful. "Well?" asked Janet, "and what do you make of the Sage of Midwich?" Bernard shook his head and looked at me. "You got me wondering," he said. "Most of your reports have been excellent, Richard, but I doubt whether you got him quite right. Oh, there is a lot of chatter, which sounds like hot air, I know. But what you gave me was too much of the manner, and too little of the matter." "I'm sorry if I misled you," I admitted. "The trouble about Zellaby is that his matter is frequently elusive, and often allusive. Not much that he says is reportable fact. He's given to mentioning things en passant, and by the time you've thought it over, you don't know whether he's followed them up with serious deductions or simply playing with hypotheses. Nor, for that matter, are you at all sure how much he implied and how much you inferred. It makes things difficult." Bernard nodded understandingly. "Well, I appreciate that now. I've just had some of it." He spent quite 10 minutes towards the end telling me that it is only recently that he has come to wonder whether civilization is not, biologically speaking, a form of decadence. From that he went on to wonder whether the gap between Homo sapiens and the rest of us was not too wide, with the suggestion that it might have been better for our development had we had to contend with the conditions of some other sapient, or at least semi-sapient, species. I'm sure he wasn't being altogether irrelevant, but I'm hanged if I can really pin down the relevance. One thing seems pretty clear, though. Erratic as he seems, he doesn't miss a lot. Incidentally, he is strong on the same line as the doctor concerning expert observation, particularly on this compulsion, but in his case for the opposite reason. He doesn't consider it hysterical, and is anxious to know what it is. By the way, you seem to have missed one trick. Did you know his daughter tried to take her baby for a drive in her car the other day? "No," I said. "What do you mean, tried?" "Just that after about 6 miles she had to give up and come back again. He doesn't like it. As he put it, for a child to be tied to his mother's apron strings is bad, but for a mother to be tied to the baby's apron strings is serious. He feels it is time he took some steps about it.
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.